Olson. I'm going to so.
Very cool.
I still got my same old whatever picture.
That's
Can't
my
get beyond reality.
that's my new virtual background for times when you want humor, when you need humor. But it's Chris once posted, because I often said I wanted a dog. I was going to name a dog Bullwinkle, so then I could be Roxy and Bullwinkle. And so one time Chris posed, he came out for a workshop here and he had a Bullwinkle hat, a moose hat. So we posed for our Roxy and Bullwinkle picture with Chris. It's a classic.
Sounds right.
Well, I see my clock says 7:01 Eastern time. You think I should go ahead and get started? And because I don't want to take any time away from Henry. So,
You know, I talk a lot.
I didn't say that, Henry. You said that.
Well, I do.
Oh, well, that's why we like having you here, Henry, because I love listening to what you have to say.
Well, I hope so.
Well, why don't I go ahead and introduce Henry, who's going to talk to us tonight about his people counts modules. And so let me introduce Henry. Let me first of all say Henry is a dear friend and colleague. And I'm just really excited that he agreed to speak with us tonight. But let me tell you a little bit about Henry. Henry is actually, he says he likes to say he's semi-retired. I'm not sure he really is. Like many folks on this Zoom call right now who call themselves retired, I'm not really sure that they are. But he's currently working at Marquette University. And Henry is in his 50th year of teaching, which is just incredible. He currently teaches an Introduction to Statistics course and a course entitled Finite Math at Marquette. Most of his career, which was 37 years, was spent in the Milwaukee Public Schools as a math and computer science teacher at Rufus King High School. And his favorite courses at Rufus King were IB Computer Science and IB Math Studies. He was involved in several writing projects that are now ASA publications for high school. One of the first projects you may be familiar with are the Data-Driven Mathematics book series, which actually are all available for free now at the ASA website. Making Sense of Statistical Studies. I know Roxy is also a co-author with that. And his recent AS publications that he's involved with are The People's Count, which was published in the last issue of Statistics Teacher, and our most recent book from the Joint Committee, the ASA NCTM Committee, which is Focus on Statistics, which is a set of investigations for high school, which he co-authored with Pat Hoppensberger and Sarah Brown. So with that introduction, Henry, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about your people's count.
Well, thank you, Chris. Before I start, I just sincerely hope everybody is doing okay and staying healthy. Clearly, these are very difficult times, and I wish you all the very best. Special thanks to Chris and Rebecca Nichols and others for inviting me to present this overview of people count. This module has been in development well over 2 decades. My work with high school students in the courses that Chris cited, IB Math Studies and IB Computer Science, along with my work in the college courses mentioned, are reflected in the development of this module. During the last 2.5 years, I decided to weave these lessons together and finally package it as something to share with teachers. I was very fortunate that the Joint Committee felt that this was something that they would promote through the statistics teacher. The target audience is students enrolled in courses that are typically titled Algebra 2, or Advanced Math. It was also used as a supplementary material for my Introduction to Statistics course and Finite Math course that I'm currently teaching. A major goal for writing this module was to engage students in mathematical modeling. I hope to highlight the connection to modeling as I define it in this module, as I share to you the development that the lessons portray. I noticed a few faces on here of some colleagues of mine from Milwaukee, and I just want to say thank you for joining me. And for those of you that know me, I really am a man of many words that sometimes get in the way. There are many stories related to my work with students involving these lessons, but I promise you I'll forego those stories for now so that I can use the time allotted to explain this module. I'm hoping that there might be a few minutes at the end to share at least one story. It is often stated that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So now I'm hoping, this is what I've been worrying about. I'm going to share my screen now, okay?
You should be able to.
Okay, let's see, right here. This is the current cover for the module. And this presents what is a theme throughout. Population pyramid graphs are used to summarize a country. These are the population pyramid graphs represented for these countries at the start of 2015. Just in case a pyramid graph is not all that familiar to you, the age groups are highlighted as we go up the pyramid graph in intervals of 5 years. So the bottom layer here is 0 to 4 years old, then 5 to 9, etc. The right side, the reddish side, represents the counts in those age groups for females, and the left side in blue represents the counts for males. What I was trying to convey with this cover is how each country has their own shape. Well, after doing that for a little while, I then also, oops, do I have to do this each time? Let me try again. Another one, and in this one right here, I combined the population of females and males and presented a histogram for each of the countries. And there's something else in here that I think is interesting to share, and that is these colored bars right here represent characters that are highlighted in the stories that are developed in each of the lessons. One main character is Kristen, and her age at the beginning of 2015 is 36 years old. So this, what I'm highlighting right here would be where she would be counted if she were living in Greenland, and likewise the color code for each of the other countries on this sheet. And as we pick up the story in the book, we find out what that means for her or for people that age. Now let's see, I need to, okay, hang on, maybe didn't do this right. I'm going to try to share now. There are other pictures that would convey to you what I think is important. Can, let's see. Okay, this picture right here is one that the Census Bureau actually presented to or made available to teachers in the year 2000. It's a picture by a famous artist in Hawaii named Herb Cain. And I really like what it conveyed. And you know what? This really captured what I was trying to do with this module. It's a painting in which there's an older person with a younger person. Much of the book is talking about the generations and the generations that are older and younger. And the title that is presented here, I think, really captures what we hope is accomplished with our census. Generations are counting on you. If I could, I really would like this to be the cover. But there is another one that came up, Let's see. And I noticed this person is on board. This is a painting by someone else who's famous. This is done by Johnny Lott. And Johnny helped me, along with Henry Kepner, who I see is on board, when I was in the early stages of developing this module. And Johnny just recently has been sharing with some of us some of his paintings. He's quite the artist, and I was very fascinated by this. This painting was based off of a photograph that was in the Anchorage Times that was taken at the beginning of this year. And this was a photo of when the first census count for this year, or for this census taking, 2020, was done. And this is in an Aleutian Island, way off in Alaska. And I think it really helps capture, again, the story of the people that are involved when we do counting. And it also, I think, suggests the diversity of our country, to think that this is where it begins. What I'd like to share with you is the table of contents. Oops. Guys, I'm so sorry. I'm not, I thought there was an easier way to do this. Okay, and now let me go back here. Here we go. This gives you a layout of how the material is organized. This is the table of contents for a student edition. The book that is posted on the Statistics Teacher website contains both the teacher edition and the student edition. Teacher edition is quite extensive in providing ideas for launching each lesson, ideas for conducting some side projects that are involved as students get into this lesson, and also contains a couple of very short little assessments that could be used to sort of figure out whether or not the students have grasped the idea of each lesson. The first unit is basically about a country's shape. These particular lessons are at this lower level of what I call the modeling continuum. They are essentially asking students to extract data from tables or graphs and to try to make sense of that data. So there is an interpretation that they are asked to express, but it is basically just pulling out the data from the various ways that data is presented. I'm going to share with you lesson 1, which gives you an idea of how it was developed for the United States. There is a similar lesson for Kenya and Japan, and I'll try to explain why those two countries are quite important in working through this. And then there is a lesson that asks students to estimate the median rather, and the mean of the population distribution for each of their countries, and a spread that is loosely the interquartile range for each of the countries. And then there is one where kids are allowed to make up their own population distribution. And if they're still not into it, I provide them a data set for a country that complements the ones I'm going to share with you. All right, let's look at the United States. And I'm going to share it with two pieces here. Okay. Can you guys see this? Oh, I don't have to keep going share. All right. This is lesson 1. And in lesson 1, the introduction is about Kristen. And Kristen has been asked to think about what is the shape of the United States. Her immediate thought is to think of that shape as you would if it were a map. In other words, the geographical shape or structure of the country. However, and this is a style that has some debate, so let me be very blunt about that, but it's one that I think is working well. And that is, there's a story that is started here in lesson 1, and almost each lesson has a little chapter of what we call Kristen's story.
Henry, you're not sharing anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, now can you see it, Kristen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. help me out with this. All right, and I won't read it to you, obviously, but the idea is you're starting to develop the characters that are used throughout the book. The criticism that I found interesting was people said, Henry, or one comment that came from a person that reviewed it is, there's an awful lot of reading in this. I don't know, don't you realize that math students don't like to read? And my answer is, I really think we should do all we can to help students read along with the mathematics. So if students are, lacking some skills in reading, or if this is not particularly one that they are into, this may have to be something that you read with them. Okay, now what I'm, okay. As they answer the questions in Kristen's story, they will be using essentially this handout. And this handout suggests to them some general comments about the population from the pyramid graph. Some of those questions deal with some of the differences in gender. Sometimes it's with the histogram, and then more accurate numbers that come from the table. Accurate in that these are the estimates that the US Census Bureau has given for our country. They are also guided in this lesson to provide a classification for the shape of this country. There is a definition provided in the lesson. The shape is a lower layered country is one in which the percentage of the population is in the 0 to 24-year-old. That's the greatest percentage. A country in which the greatest percentage of the population is between 25 and 49 would be a lower middle layered country. A country in which the population is the greatest in the years 50 to 74 would be an upper middle layered country. And then an upper layered country would be one in which it would be between 75 and 100 and plus years old. Our country turns out, after they work through this lesson and collect the data and so on, to be a lower middle layered country. So our predominant population is in this, the 25 years that are presented around here. About 32% of the country population is in that layer. Kristen is 36 at the start of 2015. So if you come to this histogram, she's right here. And keep that in mind, because as we work through a couple of other lessons that I hope I can highlight for you, turns out that you can see she's at this kind of valley of counts. As she looks at the count of people younger than her, it actually is a greater count. And the count of people older than her, it starts picking up and is also greater. To give away the story, this is developed in a couple lessons down the way. She belongs to Generation X. And Generation X is that generation that sometimes is classified as a misfit. Where do they actually fit? The students are then asked to look at two other countries. Okay, my question is, where do I find you guys? Oh, do you see Kenya on your screen now or not?
No.
No?
Henry, is there an option to share your desktop?
I don't know where it is. That's what I was hoping we would have. That's what you and I practiced on. All right, right now I can't seem to find the Zoom part right here. Okay, Zoom is here.
Actually, maybe the option is to share the screen. Is that?
All right, guys. What? Okay. All right, I'm not sure. It says on my screen, sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. And I don't have the Zoom anymore. I'm sorry, guys.
This
Okay,
sounds like me with my Zoom screens.
Okay, for some reason, I don't know. Okay.
I
you
see
can-
Kenya. I see
Yep,
Kenya now.
Okay, there's Kenya, guys. This is a lower layered country. And although it looks obviously very different, there is some lesson that actually picks up on what happens in Kenya that I would like to just draw your attention to. There is something interesting about the 0 to 4-year-old in Kenya that as we go through the modeling piece is picked up. Okay, now let's see once. What I would like to do is show you Japan. Okay, I have to admit, guys, I work with Microsoft Teams with my class, not Zoom, so I'm not familiar with this. I thought Rebecca and I had this worked out that I could just click on the desktop. Do you see Japan now, guys?
See Kenya.
Yeah, Henry, I wonder if you stop sharing and then share again.
Started.
Yeah, maybe you can choose just the screen option or the desktop, or somebody else might know better than me though.
Yeah, I was going to say choose the desktop option.
Okay, where is that?
So stop. Yeah, now go back and share screen again. Hit
Okay,
share screen. And desktop should be one of your options.
okay, oh, there it is.
Now, see whatever's on your desktop.
Okay, guys. Thank you. All right, apologize. Well, that ate up 5 minutes that I wanted to have with you. Japan is the upper middle layered country, and you can see a very different shape to it. By the way, as they connect this to the lesson that asks them to estimate the median and mean age, there are very different ages for each of these groups, as you can imagine. There is no country that I could find that was an upper layered country. However, keep this in mind as we use the model of projecting in the future. It turns out that Japan is predicted to be one of those countries in the year 2050. And there's an interesting documentary I saw on television that indicates Japan may actually be the first modern country to fade away, or might be the first country in which the predominant population is our robots. Keep that in mind. What I did create for students is an upper layer country, and just in case they wanted to have a data set, and this is how it would look. And this is very similar to the way the distribution for Japan would look using the projection model that I'll demonstrate for you in the year 2050. Can you all see that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we found the option that works. I'm so glad. Thank you. All right, you saw lesson 1. One of my very favorite lessons is actually lesson 6. I can't tell you how much students got engaged with this, and there were some spin-off projects that came with this one. And this is part of the unit that says looking back. So I provided the pyramid graphs and created the histograms for the United States in 1980 and 2015. Asked them to just basically classify the shape of our country in 1980, and it turns out it was a lower level country where the predominant percentage of the population is in the age groups of 0 to 24 years old. We then looked at each of the pyramid graphs from 1980 through 3 decades of the United States and the histograms. These are small, so they're hard to read, but in this particular part of the diagram, I highlight the age group they're looking at plus the number of people in that age group. What's interesting is in 1980, you can see that the age group highlighted in the histogram is actually the age group with the greatest count of people. That was 20 to 24-year-olds. As we progress through 1990, it is still the greatest count of people, 30 to 34-year-olds in 1990. 40 to 44-year-olds, now, well, it's almost meeting another age group that is similar in count. And in the year 2010, it is no longer the greatest age group. Look at how the numbers for these people change over those 10 years. This is the same cohort of people, and kids are asked to think of that as such. What this is highlighting is one of the age groups that belong to the baby boom generation. Also, what is interesting here is that the population grows for that group of people. That cohort of 20 to 24-year-old people in 1980 was 21.4 million. In 1990, it's 30 to 34, they're 30 to 34-year-olds, and it's 21.9 million. That increase is something that is picked up on in the discussion of this lesson. Then they're also given a timeline for this group of people. And in 1990, there is an interesting bar in this histogram that is higher, seems to be going up. And that's the 0 to 4-year-olds in 1990, and we progressed through time with that group. This is the beginning of the millennial generation. The interesting piece is this one is also growing, and at the end actually is greater in count than the age group that I just shared with you for the baby boomers. So the push-pull between the millennials and the baby boomers is sort of highlighted in here, and this has opened up some really interesting discussion. I did use the labels of the generations that were provided by the sociologists Strauss and Howe. I did not include, however, Generation Z's label, only because, quite frankly, I think the label for that generation is going to change. And what's interesting is just yesterday in our Milwaukee Journal was an article which said that they're thinking of changing Generation Z to Generation Screwed based on the current app. And when you stop to think about it, here's a generation of kids that did not have a graduation and is starting college in what I think is a very dismal way. Anyway, that's another point. All right, after we look at the past, and there's another lesson that looks at the past in a similar way for Japan and for Kenya, this is where the model that I tried to develop, which is called the recursive model, begins. Let me backtrack just a little bit. If you wanted to see it now that we got the screen working great, I could maybe share it with you. But I think it would be better to show this new model. There is a lesson, however, that builds a model that projects in the future the population for the United States using the two totals of the population in 2010 and 2015, building on that difference as if it were an arithmetic sequence. And then with that sequence, constructing a linear model. Then the next lesson builds on those same two values and constructs a geometric sequence and an exponential model resulting from that. Those are two that I'm assuming students have had some familiarity with. If not, they provide a good idea of how different you could build your projection model, your predicting of the population with certain assumptions. One assumption is it increases by a certain count each year or each 5 years, and the other is by a constant proportion. This is the new one. This is called the recursive model. In the recursive model, there is an important definition that starts this off, and they're called connected age groups. A connected age group, to start this off, is the 0 to 4-year-olds in 2010 to the 5 to 9-year-olds in 2015. Why are they connected? That is something that bothered kids in the beginning as we talked about this. But I suggested to them, well, what if all of these 20,189,589 people in 2010, the best estimate we have of the count of people from the Census Bureau, if every one of those kids lived, no one died, no one moved out of the country, and no one came, these were the same group of people, what would we expect the count of people to be in the 5 to 9-year-olds in 2015? And now they start seeing the connection. Most of the people in this age group should be the people in here, and therefore you would expect the count to be very similar. Well, they notice it's not, it's larger. So then I do direct them to create a ratio of these two populations, the ratio of the 2015 connected age group to the one in 2010. This is a pretty ugly number ratio or fraction. So reducing it to a decimal produces what is called in this module a population factor, which is my second invention of a term. What does this population factor tell us? And in the module, the lesson that I'm going to share with you, they do determine that this actually tells us that the population of the connected age group, the count of these two groups, increased by 1.4%. And as they look at this with the other connected age groups and start seeing what results, something emerges here that very clearly kids picked up on, and that is the significance of the number 1. 1 would tell us that the population count stayed the same. Greater than 1 would tell us that it increased, and less than 1 decreased. And then we talk about in this lesson, what would be the causes of an increase? What would be the cause of a decrease? And so on. You know what is interestingly hard, and I found this from groups that ranged from high school kids that I would say were struggling with math, and sometimes saw this, to college kids that I was sort of perplexed that they were challenged by this. But often when they say, I ask them, why do you think this increased? Their answer is births. That there is some sort of phenomena existing here where a person, let's say in this first age group here, where in 2015, somebody is born at the year 5 and it would be counted here. So they got to understand there's something else going on. And that something else is immigration. The lesson that goes with this builds off of those population factors. And I just wanted to share with you one, they highlight various ones and they come up with the factor and are asked to explain what they think is the dominant change in the connected age group, or what is the cause. So it comes down to immigration, emigration, and deaths. They also asked some of these ones here. Somebody who reviewed this for the joint committee and really liked it, by the way. I was very excited with his comments, but he called this my sloppy dot plot. But here's a dot plot of a fictitious country that has all of the population factors less than 1. So you'd think that all of these age groups that are connected are decreasing in count in those 5 years period. Could a country like this actually have a total population that increases? And this is setting the stage for something that's coming up in a minute called the foundation factor. And the answer is actually yes. This is actually the dot plot for Kenya. Kenya has no population connected groups in which they're greater than 1. So there's no evidence of that immigration that would add to the population. They're mostly people that over time die because of disease, yet it's one of the fastest growing countries. How could that be? Well, there's one age group that does not have a connection to it, and that's the 0 to 4 age group of the 2020, or as we move through of each of these population projections. Here's, call it the falling domino lesson, another one that actually produces some really interesting comments from kids. They use these population factors that they calculated and now are asked to say, okay, if our assumption of change in the population stays the same, okay, what would the count of people be for each of the successive age groups? So this is the population factor for 0 to 4 to 5 to 9. If we multiply the 2015 population by that factor, we come up with an estimate for the 2020 population. Likewise, we do that for each of the other ones. And now you can see, and the kids start to see, that this one age group here has nothing to connect it to. And this is the one age group that the count is strictly the count of births during that 5-year period. The stories that each of these characters have is now highlighted. Students are asked after they figured this out to go through the years all the way to 2050 and to fill in the gaps for Kristen, who is part of Generation X. For Adeline, who was born in 2012, and here's some gaps that they need to fill in for that character. She is the niece of Kristen. For Abby, who is part of the millennial generation, and for Abby, Kristen's mother, who is part of the baby boom generation. They complete this chart as they do their estimates. The ones highlighted are the ones that the students are asked to complete. Most of the other ones are done for them. And the falling domino effect is highlighted by the color codes for each of the characters that I've represented. But one can see that as we do each new iteration of this recursive model, we can predict or project a population count, but there's always this gap in the front at the top, and then that top keeps growing. So this shaded area is all a result of us not being able to use this particular part of the algorithm of the model to project a count for the 0 to 4-year-olds. But this is what we have for now. Okay. Handout 6 actually shows you how we complete the model. This is done in a lesson called the foundation factor. The foundation factors are listed here for the United States. And here's where I was struggling, or not struggling, but was thinking, how could this model actually come up with a projected count? Well, what students do know from the recursive algorithm that I just explained to you is the total count or estimate of people in 2020 from 5 all the way to 100 and plus. So in other words, that falling dominoes will will give us an estimate for all of these coming down just under the 220. The one blank is the one here. Here's another assumption we're going to make. We're going to assume, like we assumed with our projection in the future, that the population factors stayed the same. We're going to assume that the percent of people 0 to 4 years old in a country remained the same as it was in 2015. In 2015, there was 6.2% of the population 0 to 4. So students are asked to use that to predict that. Now, this came from one of the reviewers from the Joint Committee. This is the formula kids are used to figure that out. X is the count of 0 to 4-year-olds, and of course, put that X over what they can determine, plus that number of 5 to 100 plus years. And that should equal our factor of 0.062. The reviewer said he was impressed with the equation that kids had to use here and was very glad that we were promoting this kind of equation work with the students. And this came from who I would call more of a mathematics teacher than the stat teacher that I targeted with some of the other reviews. And this is how we come up with that estimate that I just shared with you on that handout. If you then go back into this, by the way, gives you a little sense. This is a teacher edition of the lesson 11 I just shared with you. I tried to, and I'll hopefully have a time to explain this modeling continuum classification a little bit more to you, but each of the problems in the lesson, I give a suggestion of where in that continuum they fall, and ideas of launching a lesson and implementing it, etc. But here are the completion of the generations that I just mentioned, which is one of the interesting problems that kids commented on. So we can see what happens to generation X as we go through time. And this would be generation Z, or the screwed generation, Adeline, Abby's generation, which is the millennials, and then the baby boom generation here. And as I said, I provide a couple of ideas for assessments, and some of these assessments use a Excel file that I will be explaining in just a second. Okay, I'd like to share with you this lesson here. which is getting towards the end of developing the recursive model. And it basically kind of indicates that if you follow this model through time, the distribution of the country begins to kind of look the same. And yet we noted when we even opened up the cover that the pyramid graphs of these countries were very ragged. What causes that raggedness? Why is it not smooth itself out like it appears to happen here? And quite frankly, it's because of events that happen, such as wars, a pandemic, economic booms or busts. And those particular happenings do change the population and counts and cause that raggedness that I was talking about. In this lesson, there is a graph that I wanted to, here it is, that shows you how these models look well over time. So if we go 100 years in the future, where the assumptions are made, the red line you see here is the exponential model. So if the assumption of the constant rate is kept for that exponential model, you can see it produces the largest increase in our population over time. This is the linear one, and here is the recursive one. I found it really interesting that the recursive seems and has carried it out even further to really look like it's leveling off. I'm sure it's an exponential that is small, the rate is small, but it's almost logistic looking. There is a flattening to what happens here over time. So students with these models can see the overall projection, but the age group projections are only calculated with the recursive model. And now what I would like to share with you is actually the conclusion that students are, and they're given this Excel model that I created for them. This is really one of those handouts that you just saw, but now this is active in Excel. Assumptions are the population factors over the years from 2020 to 2050 remain the same. And the population factors remain the same. Here's how our country looked in 2015. This is discussed with the students as a picture of our country that is the most accurate of the counts. This is what this projection model, this recursive model would say would be the count for the shape of our country in 2050. And here's a dot plot, line plot of the United States population during that time. Now, we got some assumptions. What if our country said there's no more immigration allowed, no more immigration? How would we reflect that in the model? Well, one of the ways that we can reflect it is that each of these population factors that are greater than 1 would be at, the highest they could be is 1. That there would be no evidence that there's an increase in the population due to people moving in. So let's change this population factor to 1. As I do this, watch what happens to the 2050 population. So that's 1. If you saw it, there was a little change. All of these population factors are now indicating that the count from the previous 5 years to the next 5 years stayed the same. We would assume there is some possibility, obviously, of immigration. And in fact, some kids were very not comfortable with this and wanted to change these factors to like a 0.95, which made perfect sense. They didn't change the ones that indicated the population decline because those are representing the age groups in which death starts to change the count of population. But look at the change over time of the graph. And then, what if we change this foundation factor? What if we made it what Japan is? By the way, I forgot to highlight to you when I showed you in the beginning, without changing the population factors, the end count of the United States in 2050 would be 375 million. If we did impose no immigration and we reflected it as this model might suggest, our total population for 2050 would be 345 million. Now, what if we had the same foundation factor that Japan had? Japan, as we saw, was a country that had this very middle layered group of people, a very aging population. Japan had no population factors greater than 1. Okay, so, and its smallest age group from 80 younger was actually the 0 to 4-year-olds. Japan had a foundation factor of 0.042. Now, this only changes it for this time, then it reverts back. That was intentional in design, because when the lesson explains this foundation factor, this age group right here, I think, has one of the greatest influences over the future shape of a country. In other words, the counts that we have due to birth in that 5-year range really has a significant impact of how the country will look in the future. But what if we continued with Japan's estimate? In other words, our assumption is this. Kids are asked to explain what assumptions they're making, and then look at it, and we can see a very different, obviously, shape to our country and what happens. And in fact, the total population would be projected to be 289 million for our country, a decline. And they do study that Japan has a declining population count. And finally, what if it was what Kenya was? Well, Kenya is very different. It's a 168, okay? And here again, let's assume that this continues over time. And notice we would be saying that if those assumptions were built into the model, our country would end up at 905 million people, approaching 1 billion, and a very different shape, as we can see from here. Very similar to that bottom layered shape that Kenya had. I don't want to make it go too, I think I'm about at the end where I should let you comment or question or critique this in any way you wish. There's a similar Excel file for Kenya. And if we were to look at that, maybe if we could, you know, okay, here is, the only reason I want to mention this is one of the actually more difficult lessons is kids are shown the recursive model for the United States, the recursive model for Japan, and the Census Bureau's projection for 2050 for each country. And they're very similar. So there's a sense of the underlying assumptions that both our model and the Census Bureau use are similar. It's incredibly different for Kenya. For Kenya, it turns out that we would project this booming lower level. And if you actually looked at the shape, and it's in, maybe if you're interested, I can quick resurrect that lesson. I'll see if it's in the teacher edition. Kids are asked to go through this, United States. I just want to point this out. This is the one for Japan, and it actually approaches that top layered country I talked to you about. But this is what I find interesting. Kenya's recursive model are the gray bars, and the black bars represent what the Census Bureau is predicting. It's almost similar to the current shape of the United States. So in the projection model that obviously the Census Bureau is using, not obviously, but kids are asked to think about it, is how they predict that the count, the estimate of the foundation factor and the estimate of maybe how many people live longer is different in the future. And it happened with a couple of students, but they played around with this model, and I'll leave it, kind of summarize it as this. It was almost like a game, trying to readjust the population factors and the foundation factors to come up with the estimate the United Census Bureau had. And one of my colleagues at Marquette, whose name is Steve Merle, actually wrote a very interesting paper on what he thought modeling was. And he said modeling really is very similar to what kids do when they play a game that has a strategy. And that's kind of what I saw kids do with this. There was almost this game sense of how we can change certain factors and see what the result would be, with the goal of coming up with something similar to what the Census Bureau had. And finally, I want to just explain, I struggled and struggled, I really did, with a definition of, and did this open up? With a definition of modeling. I like various definitions. I really do like what the Common Core set out to try to do. The only thing that I would fault it with is that it provided a really nice sounding goal for modeling, but the specifics were lacking. There's a report that I believe I pronounce it as the Gimme report. I really like that summary of modeling. There was a couple of others I ran across. I finally realized I didn't really want to enter into that level of the discussion. So I created what I call a modeling continuum, where there are 4 levels of what students are doing in these problems. The first 2 levels I would really say are not modeling yet. They're setting up the stage for modeling. They're extracting data, they're identifying data, they're maybe summarizing it with percents and so on. But at some point, we move to the interpretation of what they have just done. And that's where it moves into levels 3 and 4. And I provided, as best I could in the teacher edition, suggestions of how I think those problems demonstrate that if students answer them with some seriousness. Here's what I thought was actually a plus with this. Rather than maybe the teacher being given a definition, I use this handout for students. I present this to them after they complete a lesson. I ask them to identify at least 2 or 3 problems that they solved, and to indicate in these columns here how they solved that problem, but to put that problem in whatever level they think they used to come up with their answer. So the problems that said, what is the percentage of males in this country? That would maybe be summarized in the level 2, where they found the information from the histogram or from the pyramid graph, etc. But it's so interesting, it really was, to actually, and still is, to see how students classify where they think they're solving the problem. So what I think this does is provide a self-assessment for students of their understanding of modeling. If in general the modeling concept is provided here, how this particular handout gives them a little sense of what they're doing and how they're moving up their thinking into this continuum. All of these ideas about the modeling and so on are explained in the material. And there is, whoops, that's not it, I'm sorry. There is a piece that I call the overview of the module. It gives, this is in the front of the material that is posted by the statistics teacher. It comments on managing some of these real world problems. As you can imagine, with the immigration topic I just highlighted, some of these are very political and have some issues that are sensitive, warning teachers that maybe some of these topics around immigration, family planning, et cetera, come out of using this module. I think for high school students, though, that's a plus. Anyway, I suggest that they handle some of these sensitive issues by either using the stories that are developed in each of the lessons, thereby having characters that are out there for discussion, or, and you know, this actually, this is one of the stories I wasn't going to tell, but let me just give that. I actually asked students to connect with a family member or a friend or someone and tried to get out of their contact with that person some of the ways they could summarize that person, as we did with Kristen or Hannah or Rafine, the characters in these stories. And some of the stories that these kids wrote were very compelling, very genuine and serious, connecting with their grandparents or aunts or uncles or sisters or someone else. All right, now let's see. Stop sharing. Okay, so guys, that is, I used a lot of words. I don't know if you have any questions or comments.
Questions for Henry?
What was that?
I asked folks if they had questions for you, Henry.
All right.
Only, Henry, that I am so impressed. I remember, if you remember,
Yes.
when you had an accident, I think several years ago, and you couldn't go to ICOTS. Was that Slovenia?
Yep.
I believe. And I gave the recursive part,
Yes, you
I
did.
believe, of that. And thought maybe that was the end of it, but this is remarkable. This is remarkable. I'm really quite impressed.
Yes, Jerry, I thank you very much. That's one of the stories. That wasn't the one I was planning on telling, but I was painting the ceiling in my new condo we bought and fell off and broke my hip and my arm. And that was about 3 weeks before this conference. So I couldn't go. And Jerry, thank you so much. You actually presented it. The one story I'd like to tell real quickly, I really would, is as that happened, Jerry, it was right around, well, it was before that. I'll just hold this up if you don't mind. I thought I'd write an article for the mathematics teacher around that model. So I did do that. And I was very arrogant. This was coming off of the data-driven writing that we did, and which we were so proud of. So I thought I was a writer. So I submitted this article, didn't really pay as much attention to it as I should have. And that was in the day before email and so on. So we had to make 6 copies of our submission and send it to NCTM. And Johnny Lott was the president. I don't know if Johnny is still on board. He was earlier. And anyway, that comes into the story in a minute too. And I thought this was going to be a shoo-in. And I got the material back. And they had 5 reviewers that you did not know, blind. 4 of those reviewers had awesome comments. What a great, lesson, etc. And I was feeling good. However, I knew something was wrong because the opening letter said that the article was rejected. The 5th comment was brutal. The gentleman or woman, I don't know who, I do think the person was old only because it was typewritten and they didn't have the characters all in line. They were up and down. Anyway, he said this was the worst piece of writing he ever saw. And if it wasn't for the good mathematics in that article, he would tell the author to forget it. I was mad and hurt, and I put it away. And I contacted 2 people, Hank Kepner and Johnny Lott, who were friends of mine. Johnny and I were working on the navigation books at that time. So I contacted him and they encouraged me to continue working with it. A year later, it was a whole year of back and forth with this gentleman or woman who was this brutal reviewer. And I have, here it is, if you can see it, that every one of the correspondence with those reviewers. This was, interestingly, guys, one of the most challenging writing projects I had done. I don't know if anybody read the article. It was so long. I really seriously doubt that. But it felt like a major accomplishment to get it done. And that reviewer finally said, it's good. Now let's go with it. And getting that person to, get to that point, and the learning I had to do with that was special. And Johnny Lott and Hank Kepner were both there for continuing to encourage me to do that. So that's one of the stories I wanted to share. Anyway, any others? Questions?
I'm going to have to jump off to another meeting, but I wanted to thank you, Henry, for joining us. And I hope to see all of you at the next get together.
Right. Thank you, Roxy.
Bye.
Thanks, Roxy. Well, Henry, I wanted to say, I think these are just fabulous lessons. And, I think it's so appropriate that it's during our census year, and there's been a lot of issues around our census this year. But I think these lessons just help students to recognize the importance of the census, but more importantly, it allows them to discuss sensitive, real life issues in the classroom, which I think we need to do more of in our classrooms, sort of the social justice issues, the equity issues. So Henry, I just think it's absolutely fabulous. And everyone, I did put into the chat the link to the statistics teacher journal that has these lessons. Definitely check these out and think about ways that you could incorporate them into your classrooms. And Henry, it's been a pleasure to kind of watch the evolution of these lessons. Henry would often send them to me, Chris, so you want to read this? And I would get enthusiastic every time I would read them. Of course, anything that Henry writes, I've always enjoyed. He's made such great contributions. And so have so many other people on this Zoom call.
Hey, Johnny, thank you again.
Thank you, Henry. That was great.
Your picture is right behind my wall. I would show the camera, but I'd have to rearrange the furniture and so on. So that's why, but you're quite the artist. Thank you.
I just finished one more class. That's about 9 or 10 of them now.
And by the way, I noticed Dave Ebert is on board. Dave is a Wisconsin friend and colleague at Marquette. He graduated from Marquette. He and I both had John Moyer as our advisor in time. And Dave looked over the material and wrote a really neat foreword that I hope some of you would read. It's on the front material of the posting. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments for Henry? Questions? Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the K-12 chat. We will plan on having one more for the year. I would say we'll say tentatively 3 weeks from now in December, but we'll definitely get notice out. It'll either be 3 or 4 weeks in December. But we really appreciate you joining us this evening. And Henry, once again, thank you so much for presenting to us people's count.
Okay, thank you.
Henry, I have one comment because it really just brought me back. In my college, it was a modeling, I was a math major, and a lot of the courses were sort of, geared towards a modeling concept. So it resonated with me. Have you thought about how this connects to something like, building up to a calculus class where modeling would be, a good application? So the 5 college calculus textbook is designed to be a modeling foundation. I don't know if you've read it, but it's open source. I can post the link if you want.
Well, just one little comment on that. And it's a bigger comment, maybe I hope sometime for a discussion with this group. I personally am troubled with what I see in many high school courses, which we call advanced math or algebra 2. Sometimes I just don't know if they are clearly defining what goes on. And here's the problem I have. When I see these kids, and most of my students at Marquette are freshmen, so they're just recent graduates of high school. And I ask them in intro stats or finite math, their experiences in math, and most of the time it's very negative. And their comment, which I know is a teenage excuse, so put it in its proper perspective, but their comment is that they never saw, they never know where they would use anything they're learning or why is it important. So this was intended, and the students I worked with as this was emerging were students, I think, in that category where they were, the disposition was not very high for mathematics. And so the positive feedback I got from them over time was one of the reasons to keep on investing in this. However, what you say is kind of interesting because as I was writing some of this, I was working with a program at Marquette University called the Educational Opportunity Program. And I worked with a group of kids in a calculus class, and they were using Chris, his last name escapes me all at the moment. He's kind of a friend out in the University of Arizona, his book, calculus book. And they had some of these pyramid graphs, and they had some of the histograms and the projection, not at all like the model I showed you here, but they did use some of that data, and they looked at where populations would double or et cetera. And using some, techniques of rates and so on that calculus was all about. So I honestly think that these particular topics have a wide range of impact for kids that are maybe less likely to enjoy math and maybe not get the full range of, and not get to all 16 lessons by any means. But when you open it up, there are students in the STEM track maybe, or the calculus kid that I think would benefit from this too. In the overview module, I suggest that this material could be a supplement for various classes. And, I think calculus could be one. Maybe. Thank you.
All right. Well, Henry, thank you again. And if you're on the East Coast, good evening, everyone. If you're on the West Coast, I hope you enjoy your evening. If you're in the Central Time Zone, well, you're kind of in the middle, the gap. But thank you again, and we'll see you in December.
All right.
So long, everybody.
Thank you, Henry.